Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Let's just get this rolling.
All right, so a lot of our organizations face a pretty significant challenge these days with multiple compliance frameworks and legislation being required for the organization to implement throughout the environment and consider in their processes and procedures. So one of the things that we've been able to do here at LogRhythm is over the past 5 years, for me specifically, looking across about 20 or so regulations and compliance frameworks, is trying to find common ground and how SIEM and other technologies can facilitate common objectives and where you can streamline compliance. And today we're going to really look at the security organization maturity model, how compliance overlays with that, and how you can leverage compliance in some of those discussions for budgetary needs, investing in people, processes, and technology. So again, today we're going to be covering looking at compliance in the SOMM. We're going to look at it first from the SOMM perspective, and then we're going to switch to a different vantage point and look at more of the compliance drivers. We're going to look at some of the intertwining relationships between security and compliance, some of the lookout situations that you need to be aware of, and really asking yourself where your organization is at on these models, because that really kind of sets the stage and also provides a roadmap for closing some of those security and compliance gaps. And then we'll look at some of the concepts that we've developed in our compliance research team that leverage SIEM as a central data collection. And then we'll open it up for Q&A, help facilitate the discussion there. So again, my name is Bob Swanson. I've been with LogRhythm for about 5 years, have about 10 years experience in GRC. Used to work for a Big 4 accounting firm, so I transitioned off to the dark side and came over more towards the research side. But yeah, let's dive into the security organization maturity model. Show of hands, how many people have heard or seen the security organization maturity model? All right, good. Awesome to gauge the audience in terms of like where everybody's at. So what the SOMM does really, it allows the organization to look at their current position or posture, where they want to be, and then to identify some of the objectives that can help close those gaps and provide really a roadmap for the organization. Another good thing about this is that compliance and where it fits into this, it often facilitates a lot of the discussion around budget investments and needs. So an organization starting out on the low end, first time, maybe you have like a PCI audit coming up, which I know it sounds like there's a couple coming up for folks. You might be pretty new to this, and it helps give you objective prioritization when you're leveraging some of your compliance resources that come out of this. And we'll dive into that a little bit more about the GRC resources that can be leveraged in these discussions to help prioritize some of the objectives that help move the bar on the SOMM from level 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on. All right, so as we talked about before, some of the key aspects of the SOMM is that it gives you measurables around implementing threat lifecycle management throughout your organization, and it helps facilitate a lot of these discussions to have a balanced approach. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of not eating the whole security elephant, on how that can be both overwhelming to the organization as well as the personnel that have to actually enact these controls. And it also helps in terms of measuring the progress as you go from level 1 and so on. So we're going to dive into some of the different levels of SOMM, looking specifically at some of the compliance attributes, threat lifecycle management attributes, as well as the overall organizational structure and how that kind of changes as you transition. So some of the demands for this can come both internally and externally. Sometimes it's our board of directors are pushing for a specific compliance, so your company's getting ready to go public and you're doing SOX readiness. Sometimes they're external, where a specific customer might require you to have SOC 1, SOC 2 for your service organization, or ISO 27001 is another big hitter. So wherever these origins come from, it's important for the organization to understand the value behind these and then really hone in on the objectives to propel the organization forward. And there's a lot of opportunity here for GRC to be involved in the discussions around not only implementing new technologies, but training your personnel around those. All right, so in level 1, pretty much your threat lifecycle management is non-existent. You have low visibility into your organization's processes and data. Generally speaking, in terms of compliance, you're non-compliant. And when we talk about non-compliance, we really want to focus back in on risk and the risk value that's associated to this. So risk is very high. When you don't have visibility into your data or even understanding of your control gaps, that presents a huge risk to the organization, especially when we start tying into things like state level data protection laws, GDPR, all the data privacy. So again, this is one of the key opportunities for GRC to be involved in the conversation. All right, so level 1, we're starting to go through multiple audits. We feel that we're getting a little bit more comfortable. The audit reports are generally, and when I say audit reports, these are the finding reports, so the control findings. In this stage, it's usually pretty overwhelming. The audit reports are pretty big, but this gives a great opportunity for the organization to begin prioritizing those control gaps, and a lot of times this is beginning the discussion around personnel investment, as well as technology investment. So from a threat lifecycle management standpoint, we're really looking at more of a reactive approach to security. You may have checked the box on, hey, we have a SIEM, but the discussion on when you start to transition to these upper phases is how are we training our personnel and how are we getting policies in place to support that. And so as we move into phase 2, or level 2, we're really starting to move beyond the checkbox compliance. It's not only that we just have a SIEM, but you're starting to look at what systems are we monitoring, how are we monitoring those, how are we prioritizing events within those systems to indicate non-compliance or potential security events. So at this point, level 2 and beyond, really compliance becomes more repeatable. Our audit reports are slowly dwindling down. Most of our high priority risk areas or gaps have been addressed or are being addressed through a roadmap. And then really when we talk about the organizational structure, this is when policies start getting in place. And in order for policies to get in place and be translated throughout the organization, this is really where you have to have certain leadership positions in place. So when we talk about GDPR, having a data protection officer in place. CISOs generally fill that role through most organizations. Sometimes the bigger organizations can supplement with a standalone role. But the key here is that personnel are starting to be put in place, and key management buy-in is very important to kind of transition from 2 through 3 and 4 levels of the SOMM. From a risk perspective, the organization is pretty confident from a compliance risk perspective because they've gone through multiple audits. There's a lot of control ownership there. They may have even established an internal audit function to help bring that more in-house. And then in level 3 and 4, the emphasis really becomes a pivot point for the organization to now being confident in their compliance to start leveraging some of that in terms of purchasing new technologies and really training the personnel around it. So we've gone through the different levels, and we're just going to do a quick show of hands to see where folks are at. So in terms of the security organization maturity model, level 0, You may have just found out you had an audit coming up. You may be pretty new to the security side of things. You may be a small team that you're working with, maybe even a team of one. So how many people feel that they're at a level 0? Totally fine, totally fine. How about level 1? You're conducting audits. You're beginning to get visualization into the organizational risk. You're beginning to develop roadmaps. You might start to get personnel in place and policies in place, but the overall culture shift of the organization hasn't taken place yet. So how many feel they're there? Yeah, and this is a pretty critical point because a lot of times this is where compliance objectives can really drive and transition from level 1 to level 2. So how about level 2? You're a regular at conducting audits, you still don't like them. The findings report is significantly diminished. All your high-risk priorities are more or less addressed. You have key personnel in place to drive policies and procedures. And really, you're beginning to facilitate the discussion on how GRC and compliance can pivot the organization to more of a security-minded. So how many feel they're there? Awesome. And then level 3 and 4, you're just crushing the audit. You don't fear the audit. Your audit finding report, there's no big surprises year after year. You have your technology in place as well as the personnel in place. You have your policies to enact against. And the organization, specifically the board, is really encouraging the discussion on investment and growth and security. So how many feel that they're at this kind of top level? Awesome. And it's tough to get there, and I can't say that you can ever always be at that level 4. Sometimes as the organization goes through, you get new risk, you get new technologies, new business lines that present new risks. So a lot of times we may fluctuate throughout these maturity models depending on new compliance needs or new security risks that face the organization. So it seems like we all recognize that there's some growth opportunity. Now the big thing here is I want to present a little tool, and it's the SOMM assessment tool. Now there's going to be a session tomorrow to keep an eye out where they're actually going to dive into this in a little bit more detail. So we're going to scratch the surface. Really what this tool allows is for the organization to understand where their current state is in terms of their security posture, talk about where their growth opportunities are, where their goals are, and where they want to be in certain facets of security. And then it gives them more or less a roadmap, and you begin to prioritize where if you grow in a certain area, other ones will respond accordingly. And so some of the big aspects of this, when you're thinking about drivers on what might promote you to go to that future state, really it's good to look back at your compliance. And specifically, if we're working with customers, what are the customers demanding of us? For service organizations, again, we talked about SOC 1, SOC 2, ISO 27001. And to practice what we preach in LogRhythm, we're actually pursuing this right now for our cloud AI, getting our ISO certification and things like that. And that was a key driver, was our customers' needs that were there. And so a lot of the security controls and infrastructure and process and people being built up around cloud AI as an organization, there's a lot of opportunity there for GRC to really help get that certification, keep getting recertified, and demonstrate and build that confidence to your customers. So what we're looking at here is a visual representation of the SOMM. The orange circle is basically our current state as an organization. And then our goals are the blue. And what you see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, those are the levels of SOMM. So we talk about that outward growth and what is required to go from that current state out to the future state. And so it all starts with the questions on how we as an organization can adopt our culture. And a lot of it all starts with executive buy-in, but it's also the people that are on the ground putting controls in place, adhering to those policies. So it's a multifaceted approach. But the nice thing about leveraging compliance, and especially if you do your due diligence and you go through your risk classification, your data and privacy classification, all of a sudden you begin to objectively assign prioritization to these objectives. And so initially we talked about that checkbox compliance. Most compliance frameworks say you have to have some type of central management of logs. Check, we got our SIEM. We signed up for LogRhythm, we're good to go. But then you start to look at, as you're going through your deployment and you're setting up log sources and things like that, well, our log management is starting to bolster up. But in order for our teams to grow in the use of SIEM and the use of this powerful data that we now have centrally managed, there's opportunities within these other areas. And this is where I said, as you begin to grow the organization, all of these begin to be impacted. And so as the team gets trained up, it's a key feature here. As you begin to add contextualization and everything like that, alarms, automation, case management, for example, for centrally managing reporting requirements for compliance, your overall incident management as a control family suddenly begins to improve. Now the key aspect in all of this is getting back to the people and the training. So if you miss, and this is a critical miss that a lot of organizations fall into a trap, is they get too technology forward and the personnel and the training take quite a bit of time to catch up. So getting that training in early as your organization is growing is pretty important. So let's talk about making the jump and how compliance specifically fits into these transitions. So when we look at this, we're looking at primarily level 1 and 2 and like making that transition. To me, that's like a very big organization or cultural shift where people start to take ownership in the compliance requirements. They understand the security risks associated with their business process or their interactions with the system or data. And so, specifically on a compliance side, audits become more routine. There's greater process optimization. Our compliance becomes more efficient. We have less audit findings, and our key performance indicators and metrics are starting to indicate the growth. Our compliance becomes more effective. And as we get greater visibility into both our data as well as our external and internal threats, our compliance becomes more secure. And as you build these 3 pillars up, you're really setting the platform for the organization to pivot into a security organization. So what are some of the pitfalls to watch out for? So no communication between technical and audit teams. Now audit teams, really I'm referring back to GRC, depending on how your organization defines that role. Involving them early on in the discussions, when you talk about like rolling out a new, say like a payment system. When you're rolling out a new payment system, not involving GRC in the discussion early on, when you get to that PCI audit a year later, and now you're involving the GRC person, a lot of times that requires quite a bit of rework. You're probably going to have some audit findings around that, but the organizations that I've seen that have really been able to transition from level 1 to 2 and so on are really the ones that involve GRC in those discussions early on. And it's not always easy, especially when executive management isn't necessarily opening that door. Wrong way. So we talk about executive buy-in, and this is also uniform communication, which is often facilitated through policies and procedures on how you're also enforcing those. Wanting to see everything, this is kind of like SIEM overload when you just say, I want to collect everything from my environment and then I'll figure out what's important. Well, look back at your compliance, and if you've done a risk control matrix, if you've done data classification, if you've done privacy assessments, all of those resources are very key to prioritize not only your security objectives, but your log sources and what you're collecting. So you have a haystack and you have 5 needles in there that are important. How do you determine what that golden needle is? And a lot of times it's, hey, we have this PCI environment that has a business criticality of 5, It has a high risk associated to data privacy. And when you build out those calculations, it objectively assigns that value, and you can kind of go based on that in terms of where you want to focus in. And a lot of times after you do that, those lessons can be applied to lower priority items. Case management and metrics are very crucial, and I talk about this from a compliance reporting side, which kind of stems off of incident response, which we'll get into a little bit later. But what this means really is we have a SIEM that's collecting all this central data. We've now prioritized it based on our risk classification and data privacy requirements. Now, how do we collect this all in a repository where we can conduct investigations, we can add evidence to a case, we can track how long that case is open, because say you have an incident response and just so happens you have a GDPR requirement around it. Hey, we have to respond in 72 hours. So you can actually track within the case on how long the case has been open. You can escalate, de-escalate the case based on new facts or forensic data that you have coming down the line. So this is a very key aspect to leverage in terms of you want something from a compliance side or a security side where you can centrally manage and conduct investigations, and then when it comes time to report to the supervisory authority, you have it all well documented, you have the time frame around it, so it's a very important aspect to this. And then we talked about it before, trying to eat the whole security elephant. The risk prioritization from your GRC element, as well as the business appetite for security. This will help you prioritize, and this is where compliance really comes in terms of objectively assigning values to your compliance objectives and how they can be leveraged in security. So now we're going to take a little bit of a different vantage point, looking from the compliance side and diving into where the SOMM overlays with it. So the different stages in here, we have first-time adopter, readiness, attestation, and mature. So first-time adopter, probably those SOMM level 1 or 0 individuals where you just found out about the audit, policies, procedures, personnel aren't necessarily in place. Readiness, a lot of people associate this with Sarbanes-Oxley, that SOX readiness, where we're gearing up to go public, we're gearing up to have regular audits and attestation. And then you move into the attestation, and this is really where the audits become more reoccurring. You're starting to dwindle down your findings report. And then mature, you see this relates to SOMM level 2 and 4. This is really when you're kind of hitting your stride with compliance. Personnel, policies, procedures are in place. Your findings report with your risk associated to it is dwindling down, and this is really where the organizations start to pivot from compliance to security. And the thing about it is we've got to keep in mind that security helps facilitate compliance, and compliance also helps facilitate security. I'm sure there's instances where they probably hinder each other, but it's something to keep in mind that both can be leveraged in the conversation. All right, so let's talk about some key resources that really drive value in not only your SIEM deployment, but just the overall discussion of where we want to invest in technology and personnel and processes. So the risk and privacy assessment, these are key in any GRC function within the organization. Generally, it's a calculation based on various factors. It could be related to a specific business line risk. It could be regulatory or compliance related risk. Or it could be business criticality that your organization just assigns to a specific system. The next one is data classification and inventory. Again, it's gaining visibility into your environment. How are you able to protect your data if you don't know how it's coming in, how it's being processed, how your users are interacting with it, and how it's being sent off? So being able to classify that really allows you to gain that visibility. And then we talk about system classification and inventory. This is really where compliance scope applies. If you're looking at something like SOX or PCI or NERC-CIP for the energy production organizations, this is really where you say, hey, here are the systems that I'm being held accountable for by the auditors, and this really, as you start to combine all these resources, what you gain is high visibility. You begin to gain an understanding of where you can implement certain controls to gain resiliency. And as we dive into this last one, this is sometimes the hardest one to deal with, but it oftentimes provides a roadmap for you. And when you bundle that roadmap with the risk prioritization and the visibility that you gain through those other resources, this all of a sudden becomes a very valuable tool in pushing that conversation forward. So the audit scopes and findings, this tells you where you fell short on your test and gives you an opportunity then to prioritize that based on all your risk calculations that you've done before. So these are not only valuable for the organization in terms of maturing, but also in terms of your SIEM deployments, because it helps you kind of hone in on what's most important to you and your organization. So one of the things that I alluded to earlier was, with my experience here at LogRhythm and my past experience, I've gotten to see most of these compliance frameworks, and when I took a step back, what I realized is there's a lot of common objectives across all of these. When we look at this one specifically around incident management and response, you know, an organization, depending on where you do business regionally, what business lines you're in, what industries, you may be adhering to one or many of these. And so when you have many compliance requirements, one of the things that's most beneficial to organization is begin to streamline and understand the shared common objectives across these. And so we look at some of these, some of the more heavy hitters, SOX, GDPR, SOC 1 and 2, HIPAA, they all touch on incident management and response. And so when we talk about how that's facilitated in the SIEM or other technologies, that technology remains the same. The strategy around it remains the same. However, we got to maintain an understanding that reporting requirements may be different. So when we look at like GDPR, the time requirements, what certain data has to be communicated to the supervisory authority. So it's important to understand the end game of reporting on incidents and stuff may be different. But the overall objectives of facilitating incident response remain the same across the board. So the consolidated compliance framework, this is something that we've been developing over the years, and it really aims to look at common control objectives across multiple frameworks, guidelines, or legislation. So when we look at this to kind of piggyback off of our incident response, what we've done is say, there's control families, which are a common set of controls that generally facilitate the same objective. So incident response, user access management, privilege access management, business continuity, data and privacy protections. These are just some of the examples of the control families that we've come up with. But what we begin to see is that generally these objectives are common across the board. And it's important to realize this because it's an opportunity to streamline your compliance objectives and not be overburdened by trying to conduct multiple audits around the same thing. All right, so where we're at today with CCF, we looked at various frameworks and we wanted to pick the ones that had the most common controls that we're seeing across all of the frameworks. They were influencers or gold standards in either the international market for a specific industry or, sorry, not the specific industry, but they had the most influence both domestically and internationally. So from a data privacy protection, GDPR is kind of the buzzword right now in terms of data privacy and protection. ISO 27001, from an international standpoint, a lot of those objectives influence other industry-specific objectives. So that's one that a lot of frameworks look to in terms of guidance. And then the NIST series, more domestically here within the US, such a great resource available through NIST with, you know, if you need to have information on conducting a risk assessment, they have a specific NIST special publication around that. So definitely recommend looking at those. But this was kind of our decision point in terms of what our core of CCF would be. And then what happens is it creates this central amount of, or central content that we can pull from AIE rules, reports, investigations that map to these individual frameworks. And where we're going to go is now we're going to start looking at some of our industry-specific frameworks, such as PCI, HIPAA. We're also going to look at more of those international ones, because when you look at those, a lot of the organizations or governments are adopting a lot of these practices, especially around data privacy and protection. I know like Saudi Arabia just launched one, Australia has one that got released, and it's basically their version of GDPR. So when you think about that, there's a lot of common objectives there. So we're going to start branching out more into the industry-specific ones within compliance research, but this is just to give an idea of where we're at currently with CCF today. And so the next steps, we do have a demo available. I'd be happy to show it to you as time allows. But real quick, I just want to go over a couple additional resources. The SOMM workshop, we kind of touched on that earlier, is going to be tomorrow. So definitely recommend going to see that. There's various links on here that I would recommend from a compliance side. LogRhythm community, that's where our guides currently live with deployment guides and user guides. We also have a tips and tricks video, a couple of them out there, specifically around how many people have dealt with smart responses? Anybody yet? So we have an SRP that we're developing around CCF specifically, where we have better ability to integrate compliance scope within the SIEM. So if you do have a malware alarm that hits on a PCI environment, as the case pops up, you'll know that that is what's in scope, and then you can integrate playbooks with that, where you can say, okay, I know what my PCI requirements are. Here's the information that I gotta collect. I have to demonstrate this understanding, and I have to get this report out in so many hours. So tips and tricks are in the SRP are going to be pretty valuable there. If anybody's interested in just what compliance frameworks we have in scope for our knowledge-based content, you can go look at that out on the community. And then also talk to your SEs or CSMs if you are interested in the SOMM. They should be able to facilitate that for you. And then also with Rhythm World on our community site, this is a really good resource to go to. One of the things that I've enjoyed about Rhythm World as an employee is the community that's established. And the idea that somebody has probably faced a similar issue as your organization, and they may be 6 months ahead and have some like tidbits of information that you can take away. So this is a really good resource to go out to. There's a forum out there, as well as all of these presentations. So if you happen to miss one that you wanted to attend, all these are going to be recorded and you can go see those as well. So with that, I'd like to open it up to Q&A. Any questions you have specifically around CCF, a compliance issue that your company is encountering, we can always table and talk about later. So I've been on all sides of the audit. I've conducted the audits. I've helped facilitate staff augmentation around internal audit. Been more on the research side now with LogRhythm. So I felt the pain throughout the life cycle of compliance. So yeah, thank you everybody.
Any questions from anyone? Bob is resilient, don't be afraid.
So some of the compliance standards that are coming out, like ISO does have a cloud standard now. Are any of those compliance standards going to work into your roadmap at any point?
Yeah, so we're talking specifically around like cloud environments and protecting that.
Yes.
Yeah, so when we talk about cloud as an environment, some of the control groups or control families are still going to apply with like user access management, privilege access management, business continuity around that, like what are we doing with the data and things of that nature. So there's overlap there. It's more about the logging capabilities of the cloud environment that can vary a little bit, but when you talk about it, when you focus back in on those core objectives, a lot of times regardless if it's a cloud environment or not, you're going to be applying the controls, but how you design and implement them might be different for those specific environments. So cloud is a really good example where it's kind of this new concept in compliance, but a lot of those core objectives will still apply. So if you have an incident that happens in your cloud environment, you're still going to have to collect and build evidence around the case. You're going to have to demonstrate an understanding around what data elements were breached, and you're still going to have to meet those reporting requirements. So although the environment may change, the control families are still going to be applicable. Yeah.
Right, so you're gonna add those onto your list, like how you have the ISO 27000 series? Sorry,
that's
so
okay.
kind of how you have the ISO 27000 series specifically listed out, are you gonna include some of those future cloud compliance standards that come out as well? That's
Yeah.
what I'm asking, it's just like, whenever you get the certifications for that, are you guys going to also have those cloud compliance certifications as well?
Are you talking like certifications specifically for LogRhythm?
Yes.
Okay. We will have that for Cloud AI. We're currently going through the process of the ISO certification for that. In terms of our content that we provide, the nice thing about CCF is it allows us to maintain and distribute updates quicker because we have a core set of objects. And so that'll allow us to integrate changes a little bit quicker. But generally speaking, from our internal certification process, our OCISO group is heading that up with, I think we're going SOC 2 Type 2 currently, and we're in the final stages of ISO certification. So those certs will be available for any customers or partners that need that validation. Hopefully that answers it.
Thank you.
How is the LogRhythm product itself coming along with GDPR certification?
Gotcha. So in terms of certifying our software, I don't know that you can actually get the GDPR cert. Like they don't just hand you a cert. What we're doing right now, so our OCISO group is in charge of all that because it is organizational wide. And when we talk about customer data and stuff like that, we have a responsibility to our customers. And so we've recognized that. And so GDPR we're practicing what we preach. So our OCISO group is heading up that GDPR objective, implementing policies and procedures around that, educating our employees around data protection and privacy requirements. So it is something that we currently have in play. It's something that's, as most organizations, going to be ongoing development as new sanctions come out. Like, I thought this one was really interesting. PwC got a huge fine for their own employees when you think about a Big Four auditing firm that usually has some consulting around GDPR to have their own findings. So it's something that as a security organization, we got to practice what we preach at the end of the day. So GDPR is something that we're currently pursuing and will continue to pursue.
Even for the platform itself?
For the platform itself, that's a really good question. I know that it is because we have to. At the end of the day, if we're bringing in customer data and it's something that we have to adhere to. So it is being considered in all new business ventures in terms of like cloud AI and those features. Their GDPR and GRC discussion is involved in all those. So it's an ongoing facet in most of our advancements in the company from a platform and technology perspective, yeah. Which is challenging, yeah. Any other questions? Cool, and just to let everybody know, my email address is up there. Feel free to contact me. I'm, again, more on the research side, so not really big into sales or anything like that, but I am pretty big into advocating for groups in terms of helping them through some of their phases and stuff like that, giving tidbits of information that could help. So with that, if there's no other questions, I have a demo ready if people want to stick around. I don't know if we have time for it, but
Yeah, if you guys want to stick around and watch the demo, by all means. Otherwise, you can go ahead. We can break a little bit early. You guys are more than welcome to have a little bit extended break before the lunch. But yeah, Bob, if you want to hang out, if anybody wants to hang out with Bob and watch the demo, we can certainly run that to the top of the hour. So let's just give it up for Bob one more time. Thanks again, everybody. And thank you all.
All right, so we'll give them a minute so that people clear out. Cool. All right, so this might be kind of hard to see. But what we're going to be looking at here is really looking at the council side of things. We're going to go kind of end to end from implementing log sources to integrating with our first version of the SRP, and then I'll talk briefly about SRP2 that's coming out for us and what those features will look like. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're looking at entity structure. And this is where we're starting to bring in log sources. And so things like data classification, system classification, all those prioritizations around what's important to the organization, this is where it comes in handy, where you can start to bring those systems in first and prioritize those higher risk items to get monitoring controls around. So we're implementing from a simple text file, accepting those log sources. And then this is kind of hard to see, but basically we're looking at a specific list, the CCF all log source list, and this is where we begin to integrate compliance structure within the SIEM. So if a system can be in scope for, say, NIST 853, but also be in scope for PCI, so we want to add those into the individual lists. So that way, if we have multiple compliance frameworks, if an event happens in that environment, we can know, hey, we got to meet both of these requirements, instead of having no visibility or correlation to what specific compliance requirements there are. So what we're doing here is we're actually adding those new log source hosts into the list. And so now we've really integrated our compliance scope within the SIEM. So it looks like they're in scope for both GDPR and NIST in this demo. And this is something that when you're talking with like PS hours and stuff, I don't know if anybody's gone through like a PCI engagement with PS, but it takes 3 days. So these are important discussions to have, and especially like leverage these resources, because your groups have put in a ton of effort, probably a lot of headaches and stuff, so it's important for you to integrate those in that conversation. All right, so what we're doing here is we are generating the case API token, which you can do through going into the user view within the console, clicking on a specific user, and then there's a way to generate that key. And so make sure you always copy that when you're doing a SRP setup, because it's pretty annoying to go back and it's extremely long and you can't really remember it. So now what we're doing here, this is SRP version 1.0. So it's really driven on host impacted right now in terms of the functionality. And so what you have to do is you have to input some of the key values like list IDs. You have to input your user token. You have to say what level in the list you want to go look at. So level 0 is probably that parent list like CCF all log source. Then when you go level 1, that's usually where it's optimized, and you look at the individual compliance lists. I'm trying to think some of the other items in here. So you have to implement this for the AI, each CCF AIE rule. However, again, it's all objective prioritization. Once you figure out what's more important for your organization to close those security gaps, that's probably where you want to focus on it first in terms of getting those SRPs implemented. And a lot of this is starting to bake in some of the SOAR aspects when we're talking about case automation, adding similar cases into one case so you can bundle those together. All right, so what they did here was they configured the SRP. You have to restart the AI engine to get this, the configurations in place. And this is kind of hard to see, but what we're looking at is case management actually. And so this is our first iteration. I'm going to pause it here and see if. Okay, how about that? Okay, so what we're looking at here is within the case notes, this is the CCF lookup, and basically the first iteration of this SRP is just looking at if a specific host is listed under a compliance framework. And what it's doing is it's bringing that back and saying, hey, this alarm fired, whatever it is, it may be like audit log cleared, like somebody's trying to clear evidence of their activities or something. And it's saying, hey, this hit on an environment that's in scope for NIST as well as GDPR. So then you start to, your compliance mind gets in and you're like, okay, what's my next steps for GDPR and NIST? And so all that can be facilitated within this. Where we're going with iteration 2 is starting to bring in that control mapping. To me, that's the bread and butter of kind of what I do for the organization. And so what that does is now all of a sudden, not only do you get the compliance framework, you also get the respective control family, which we assign based on just common control families that we see across the board, so it's not unique to LogRhythm. And then you also get the individual control mappings. Now these come up within the notes of case, so the organization, you can actually say, as we interpret these controls, they're not actually part of this alarm. They're not in scope for this. So you can pare down that list of controls, and then that helps facilitate a lot of the investigation. So if you have a control around, we'll say privileged access management, and you had a breach, you know that privileged access management is maintained by IT security, it's maintained by approvals through management and stuff like that. So you now understand which individuals you have to go to, what systems you may have to go to pull evidence from, and things of that nature. So having that control aspect to it, to me, is something that we've missed on in the past, but the organization has started moving in that direction in terms of really integrating that scoping control frameworks into the SIEM. So all this is going to be facilitated in SIEM, and the nice thing is it's something that we're continuing to work on. So I was working late the past 2 nights trying to get SRP 2.0 demo up and running. It's almost there, but we should have it out here soon in a tips and tricks, and most of our SRP work is going to be demonstrated through those tips and tricks, so I definitely recommend you going out there. So any questions about this functionality, what you saw, or future prospects? Any pain points or worries about upcoming audits? All right, cool. Well, thank you everyone once again.